Anyway, this morning, what we're going to focus on is the discovery of the White House tapes and then the events that transpired. Because what happened in this chronology, in essence, was the spotlight on us changed from the discovery of the tapes. Up to that point, we were really talking about laying out a case, informing and educating people about who said what to whom and when. And all of a sudden, after John Dean's testimony, everybody was curious as, was John Dean telling the truth? And obviously nobody knew. And I talked about this a little bit last week. There were strong efforts by particularly the Republicans on our committee, but the White House as well, to basically attack his credibility and diminish the truth, try and diminish the truthfulness of what he said. In retrospect, he had a remarkable photographic memory and had obviously taken some notes following his meetings with the president, because nothing that the White House put together diminished the truthfulness of what he was saying. But we didn't know that at the time. And so as we were moving forward with respect to John Dean, whether he was telling the truth, our next witness was John Mitchell, and this was in July of '73. And while we were dealing with John Mitchell publicly, the White House insisted that we call a man named Richard Moore, who was a public relations executive working in the media office at the White House at the time, because he was going to buttress the White House's version of the meetings with Richard Nixon, and it was going to be contrary to John Dean. So we agreed that we would put on Richard Moore, but it would happen right after John Mitchell. And so we finished John Mitchell on a Thursday afternoon. And Friday morning, we learned that Richard Moore was going to testify that afternoon, that was when the White House wanted and the Republicans wanted, so we agreed to it. I had just interviewed, Terry and I had just interviewed Richard Moore, and from what we learned, nothing he said was going to contradict what John Dean said, nor was it going to support the president that strongly. But at lunchtime on Friday, when we saw his written statement, it changed dramatically from what we'd gotten in the interview a week earlier. And so we hurriedly put together a sort of a very tough cross-examination of him along the lines of, well, do you recall saying X on such and such a date? No, I don't. Well, let me read to you what you said, and that kind of thing. And so, since my boss Terry was doing the cross-examination, like it was a courtroom, we thought it was incredibly effective. Unfortunately, we weren't familiar with TV and what it did, but what the TV showed was this young, aggressive prosecutor going after a man with white hair, not much more sympathetic to now than I was then. A man with white hair who had a crew cut and who got so confused when he was testifying that he finally just blurted out, well, I'll stand on my answer, whatever it was. And his own lawyer started laughing, and we have a great picture. I couldn't find it in preparation for the class. His own lawyer was rolling his head backwards, laughing. And Senator Ervin leaned over to Terry and said, you know, Terry, I think that's enough. You've damaged him enough. We finished that, and I should try and create the chaos that was enveloping us at this point. Because at the same time that we're dealing with Richard Moore publicly, we also have to prepare for Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman and Chuck Colson, who are following John Dean. So one of my colleagues, Scott Armstrong, took the assignment of leading the interviews for I think I talked about the satellite charts that we had for each of our witnesses, secretaries, assistants, direct reports, etc., that we would always interview before we have testimony of the principal. So Scott took the leading role to interview satellites around Bob Haldeman because he was going to be another week and a half after that session that we just had. So the first person he decided to interview was Alexander Butterfield. And Butterfield had reported to Haldeman for a year and a half, almost 2 years, before he became the appointee at the Federal Aviation Administration in the second Nixon administration. So Scott decided that he asked a Republican staffer, a guy named Don Sanders, to accompany him to make sure we had a bipartisan presence at the interview with Butterfield. We had no idea whatsoever that Butterfield was going to be anything other than sort of a cooperative witness who tells us about Haldeman's day and how he works and this and that, but had no inclination whatsoever that he knew anything more than that. So, in part of the White House effort to undermine John Dean, they sent the Republicans a summary of all 7 meetings that President Nixon had with John Dean, typed out in a formal document. But they sent it only to the Republicans. They did not send it to the Democrats. A day before Butterfield's interview, one of the Republican secretaries slipped a copy of the document under his door to Scott Armstrong to give him to prepare for the hearings. Now, ironically, this document, which is designed to undermine Dean's credibility and prop up the White House, is what ultimately led to its downfall. Because in the interview itself, Scott began asking Butterfield how the White House kept track of the meetings that President Nixon had with staffers and other people. So he asked the first question, and Butterfield said, well, oftentimes the president just dictates a memo for the file, and Rosemary Woods types it up, and that's filed. Scott said, what other mechanisms would they use? And Butterfield said, well, another way they did it was when other staffers were sitting in the meeting, they would draft up or they would dictate a summary of the memo that would be typed up by Rose Woods and put in the official file. And Scott said, well, so that's how they prepare summaries. And he takes out the summary that he's been given by the Republican secretary. And he starts to flip through it. And as he's flipping through it, he realizes that he hasn't exhausted all the possibilities of how meetings would be summarized. And he said, well, let's see, were there other means, at which point Don Sanders cuts in.
He's Republican.
Don Sanders is a Republican former FBI agent working with the Republicans on the committee. So Don jumps in and says, was there any reason for John Dean to know that the White House was bugged? Like that. At which point Butterfield hits his hand on his forehead and says, I was afraid you were going to ask me that question. Yes, the White House was bugged. Don't go yet. At which point, Scott pretty much jumps out of his chair, and they finish the interview, but not before Scott gets a subpoena. This interview is on Friday, July 13th. Scott gets out a subpoena, writes in the date Monday, July 16th, and hands it to Butterfield at the end of the interview and says, you're going to need to come back on Monday because you're going to be testifying publicly. Because this was obviously a significant piece of information. And it obviously, in retrospect, turned the whole situation around.
Wait a minute, Mr. Lackerts, was Scott going around with signed subpoenas?
He had, yes, we had blank subpoenas
Whoa.
for this very situation.
Did Senator Urban know that you were going
Yes.
around with signs?
Yes, he did.
Who signed
He did. He proved- Senator Urban.
But then,
He didn't know what the subject
Right,
was.
right.
like, you didn't know who it was for.
Placeholders.
Yes.
So as the interview finished up, Scott hands the subpoena to Butterfield. He didn't have an attorney at the time. And Butterfield was supposed to go to Moscow on Saturday for a meeting on airline safety. And he sees the subpoena and sees that he's supposed to be back on Monday, the 16th, before the committee. And Butterfield looks up and says to Scott, does this mean I can't go to Moscow? And so it's another example of witnesses that want to travel rather than appear publicly. And Scott says, I don't think you're going to Moscow. Which in retrospect is surprising because my guess is this White House would say, he's going to Moscow, too bad. See what you can do about it. But Butterfield,
We can't do that.
but Butterfield did show up. Now, what happened was, as soon as the interview was over, Terry and I had just come down from Richard Moore and trying to undercut his credibility. And I was back in my little carrel, which was as you go down the auditorium was on the right, and it was the first one on the right as you came down about 50 feet.
What is the switchboard doing?
The switchboard, meanwhile, our switchboard is lighting up. We had, as I recall, it was someplace close to 1,000 calls after the Richard Moore testimony, complaining about the aggressive young prosecutor attacking the kindly old man. It turns out, in retrospect, Richard Moore was 55 years old. Only 55 years old. But Terry was 31 or 32, and he was aggressive. Anyway, so the switchboard's lighting up, and Scott comes barreling down the aisle, races into my carrel, and says, we've got him, we've got him. And I go, what are you talking about? He says, the White House was bombed. At which point we talk about, okay, how are we going to put this on? We're going to put it on Monday. We're going to have to talk to Sam Dash. We're going to have to do this and that, and a number of other things. And we were convinced, nobody knew, obviously, what the tapes were going to say. We were convinced that they were going to buttress John Dean's credibility and undermine what the White House was saying. Meanwhile, Don Sanders goes back to Fred Thompson's office, the minority counsel, and says, we've got it, we've got it. The tapes are going to prove that Nixon is not lying. And so there was a quick agreement between Baker and Ervin that they would put Alexander Butterfield on first thing Monday. But we wanted it to be a surprise. Like, any good drama needs a little bit of surprise. It needs humor, it needs surprise, it needs plot, etc. And so on our side, there were only four of us who knew what was going to happen. Terry, Sam Dash, Scott, and me. And I only knew because Scott and I were buddies and sort of traded information all the time. On the Republican side, obviously, more people knew, but over the weekend, we sort of had an embargo on any work or any discussion. And we were all under oath not to talk about anything having to do with Alexander Butterfield.
Right, can I tell my story?
Yeah, absolutely.
I wasn't one of the four. The Lackerts and I are living together. And so it's this whole week, and we're working. We don't know who we're working for. We do not know that he is the surprise witness. That Monday. And so come Sunday night, it's been a weird weekend, and this guy's like, Lacquerts is just like in another place, but it's Lacquerts. But that Sunday night, it's 1 in the morning, it's 2 in the morning, it's 3 in the morning, and I finally say to him, what is going on? This is ridiculous. We've got to get to sleep. And he says to me, can I tell you something? And I said, yes. Do you promise you won't say a word? I said, Mark, it's 3 in the morning. Who am I going to tell? He says, well, then okay. And then he tells me that the White House is bugged, and we got this witness. And I say, well, we don't know what the tapes are going to say. We don't have the tapes. Where are the tapes? Not to worry, but we're going to get this testimony on Monday. So now we come to Monday, and I just have one word for lesson.
Go ahead.
All right, so now we come to Monday. We still don't know the name of this dude. Maybe we do, maybe by
No,
then.
you don't.
I said, I do know his name because I am told G308 was the committee room, that auditorium that was reconfigured into being this slapshot of offices. And witnesses don't come to G308. Witnesses usually are brought by their counsel to another agreed upon location. They don't come to where the staff is or where the documents are. Well, not so with Alexander Butterfield. He apparently, I don't even know if he has a lawyer, but he has appeared at the doorway of G308. And then Terry says to me, and this won't be the last time Terry has said to me, you've got to go and get him and take him next door. Senator Ervin, there was a little white house where the Senate Park building is today. There was just a little house that Ervin had as a hideaway office. And that's where I was supposed to take this guy. So outside the committee door is a buzz with reporters. And I'm very anxious because I'm a chatty person. And I think to myself, oh my God, how am I going to be able to manage this? Everyone's going to want to know who he is. And so I said to myself, just don't say anything. You'll be just fine. Just for once, don't say anything. Armed with this wise counsel, I go outside, I take Mr. Butterfield. We are immediately accosted by Leslie Stone. Mary, who is it? Who's the witness? I don't say a word. And I see her reaching down to his briefcase. He has a luggage tag on his briefcase with his name on it. And I think, oh, I haven't said a word, and I'm still going to blow it. So I reach down and I'm covering it up, dutifully escorting this guy that's a foot taller than I am. And it was a happy ending. His name was not divulged. I had nothing to do with any divulging of that. But those are my 2 Butterfield encounters. And I'm just a little staffer behind the scenes. So that was now we can capture
Now, yes, we're gonna show a brief excerpt for Butterfield's testimony. And what happened was all weekend we prepared questions for the senators to ask that tried to evoke more information about when the bugs were put in, who put them in, how they were stored, how the tapes were stored, who had custody, how they were organized, etc. But before getting to that, let's just do a brief summary of Butterfield's testimony.
So you were employed on January 21st, 1969, and continue to be employed until March 14 of this year. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
When were those devices placed in the Oval Office?
Approximately the summer of 1970. I cannot begin to recall the precise date. My guess, Mr. Thompson, is that the installation was made between, and this is a very rough guess, April or May of 1970 and perhaps the end of the summer or early fall 1970.
Are you aware of any devices that were installed in the Executive Office Building office of the President?
Yes, sir, at that time.
Were they installed at the same time?
They were installed at the same time.
Could you tell us a little bit about how those devices worked, how they were activated, for example?
I don't have the technical knowledge, but I will tell you what I know about how those devices were triggered. They were installed, of course, for historical purposes, to record the president's business, and they were installed in his two offices, the Oval Office and the EOB office.
That's just, that's the gist of what he said. Now, obviously this had a huge impact. So since the main question was John Dean telling the truth, got flipped to who was going to get the tapes, what did the tapes say, and what specific tapes should we ask for? So immediately after his testimony, we got together to figure out which tapes specifically we needed to ask for. Steve, you got a question?
Yeah, Mark. At what point did you know how long the tapes went back to? That they weren't erased after a week or a month or anything like that?
We learned pretty quickly that they kept them all the way back to the summer of 1970. So we were pretty confident that the meetings that John Dean described should have been taped.
Yeah, it's first one was September 15th, right?
Yeah, September 15th was the first one. That's right. So I got the task of drafting a subpoena from the committee to the White House to turn over those 7 tapes. Now, I need to fill in a little bit about the chaos that was ongoing at this time. Our committee was in chaos because we were still putting on public hearings and having staff interviewing people when they testified, staffing the hearings while they were going on, figuring out where the hearings were going to go, and we didn't know, we had no idea where we were going. I mean, nobody knew what the tape said, nobody knew so we had witnesses lined up, but it was a little bit chaotic. At the same time, the investigation had become a bit of a 3-ring circus in the sense that a special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, had been appointed by Elliot Richardson back in May of '73, right around the same time that we were beginning our public hearings. Archie Cox had come to Senator Ervin and asked him not to have public hearings because he was worried that it would bias any trial afterwards because people would already have a view. Senator Ervin politely declined to do that. So we had Archibald Cox and the Special Prosecutor's Office, who also now wanted to get access to the tapes. So I drafted a subpoena, and you can see there Senator Ervin is signing it, and on to my right, as you're looking, on the right is Sam Dash, and on the left is Terry Lenzner. And for some reason, I still had a part in my hair, which Mary hadn't been able to obliterate at that point. And Senator Ervin said to make it as narrow as possible. So I drafted it to just ask for the tapes of those 7 specific meetings that John Dean had testified to. The special prosecutor did exactly the same thing. And we came to be pretty good friends with most of the staff on the special prosecutor's office. Richard Benveniste was the primary lawyer on it. And his subpoena was very similar to ours. And they were both served on the White House in the next week, calling for the tapes to be turned over in about a week's time. Now, this is like the fulcrum in which the whole investigation switched, because now we're in no man's land. We don't know what the tapes say. We don't know if we're going to get access to the tapes. And by the end of that week in July, the White House says they're not going to turn over anything because it's privileged by executive privilege, and they're relying on that.
Just before you go too far, you mentioned that a subpoena was served. How was that subpoena served? Did you have marshals come and serve subpoenas?
No, we would call the White House counsel ahead of time, and they would agree to meet us out on the west side of the White House, up where you could drive up almost to the gate in those days of where the White House was. So I would drive my 64 Chevrolet.
Did that car have a name, Mr. Lacker?
It did, but that's not normal.
We didn't want to hear it.
And but on this subpoena for the tapes, because it was going to be newsworthy, Rufus Edmiston, our deputy chief counsel, and Terry were going to serve it, and so they left my car out of it and went over by taxi to serve the subpoena on the president for these 7 tapes. It was somewhat newsworthy because the first time anybody had subpoenaed the White House for information like this in a long time, and it may have been the first time ever, I'm not sure. Anyway, the lawsuit goes forward, and it's joined. Our lawsuit, along with the special prosecutor's lawsuit, are merged together into one case. And Judge Sirica decides that the special prosecutor should get access to all 7 tapes, but that we shouldn't, because we hadn't shown an adequate legislative purpose or need for tapes as opposed to transcripts or summaries or other things like that. Well, we were, not surprisingly, very disappointed not to get access to the tape. But the White House appealed up to the Court of Appeals because they didn't want to turn over the tapes to the special prosecutor. And we appealed to the Court of Appeals because we thought we were unfairly denied access to the tapes. So the Court of Appeals gets the case, Younger.
Well, you commented that you were initially denied because there was no legislative reasoning for you to have possession of the tape. Why did they hook it on legislation?
Well, because Congress doesn't have unlimited power to delve into people's business. Congress has the power to investigate, evaluate, and legislate, basically. And while we thought we needed a good, clear, factual record to make legislative recommendations, the judge, in this case it was Sirica, said, no, you actually don't. You don't need to have the tapes themselves. You'll be fine with substitutes. Yes, Steve?
Did they offer transcripts? Is that what you're saying, that you could get the transcripts?
They offered summaries.
Summaries, not
And as the appeal went on, in late September, early October, they specifically asked Archie Cox to drop his subpoena or take summaries or transcripts. And he, to his credit, refused to do that, which then gave rise to the Saturday Night Massacre, where President Nixon directed Elliot Richardson to fire Cox. Yeah, Richardson quits. He resigns instead of following the order of President Nixon. And his deputy, Bill Ruckelshaus, also resigns as a matter of principle. But Cox is fired, at which point our friends in the special prosecutor's office don't know if they have a job or not. They seal the offices so that nobody can take anything out and nobody can bring anything in. And it was, we remember that Saturday night very clearly. You guys may too, from where you were when you heard the news. We were getting my 64 Chevy, a new set of brakes.
Oh, for God's sakes. We drove it for 3 days with no brakes. And it was my job to hang out the window and say, we have no brakes. As we would coast our way back. Luckily, it was downhill. Oh, anyway.
I'm getting a little bit ahead of the tapes, but were you allowed to listen to the tapes, or were these reel-to-reel tapes, were they cassette tapes, or were these 8-track tapes that you put into your '64 Chevy?
They were the big reel tapes.
Oh, wow.
This is, technology from 1970, basically. And so you had these big tape recorders, and that's where they went. They weren't cassettes, they were small. Yeah, Joyce.
So Mark, you were talking about it and referring to it as the White House was bugged. But this was not that it was bugged. It was done because Nixon wanted it, right?
Right.
So bugging is usually when someone doesn't know. Did the rest of the staff know when they went in there?
No.
So how many people really knew?
What John Dean didn't know, curiously, Haldeman knew, Butterfield knew, and the staffers, the technology staff that put them in knew. That was it.
And Edelman didn't know.
No.
Okay, hold on.
So the Saturday Night Live. So anyway, so the irony is Mary and I are in the Sears car repair shop in Tenleytown in DC getting a new set of brakes. And we're watching the TV, and all of a sudden there's a bulletin that Cox had been fired and Richardson and Ruffleshouse had resigned. And we thought, oh my goodness, we better get down
To the White House.
to the White House. Now, why we thought we needed to get to the White House, beyond me, but kids do stupid things. So we get in our car, the brakes are fixed. We drive down Wisconsin Avenue. When we see a kid hitchhiking, we give him a ride because he's obviously going to the White House too. There was a huge throng outside the White House demonstrating in the wake of the Saturday Night Massacre. And the kid that we picked up turns out to have been the younger brother of one of our colleagues on the staff of the Watergate Committee. So it's a very, very small world.
So the important thing there, though, is Navy destroys Air Force.
Right.
Sorry that you saw that.
Yeah.
Don't let Bob see it.
Right. Right.
Mark,
Bob, congratulations. Yeah, Gene.
when did Agnew resign?
When did who?
Agnew? Wasn't that around
That's right around the same time. That's at the end of October.
End of October.
Yeah, 73.
So all the cards are falling down.
Yeah, well, yes, all the cards are falling down, and it's not clear that Humpty Dumpty's going to get. And it turns out after the Saturday Night Massacre, the House Judiciary Committee votes to initiate an impeachment inquiry and hires John Doerr, and he hires another staff. So the 3-ring circus has now become a 4-ring circus because now the House Judiciary Committee also wants the tapes. And so everybody's pursuing the tapes. Nobody's getting them at this point. The Court of Appeals later on in the fall hands down its ruling that we, the Watergate Committee, do not get access, but the special prosecutor should get access. At the same time, after Bob Bork fires Archie Cox, Bork finds Leon Jaworski and appoints him the special prosecutor to follow on to succeed Archie Cox. And Jaworski assures the entire staff of the special prosecutor that they're all going to be kept on board and that he is just as devoted to finding the truth as Archie Cox was. So
I had one little more moment in the sun, because remember we talked about the computer and how we had all of our documents and interviews and everything built into this crazy computer system that I was initially a part of as far as how you were going to read and summarize the documents into this format. And I knew how to do it. Now we were going to share all of this information with these various entities willingly, but none of their staff knew what it was that we were doing. So I got to show them what we were doing and how to organize it, which then got me out of the research world and more actively into an investigative posture where I was working with Scotty, and I didn't have to do all the summaries, at least for the full committee wide anymore. So it was a lookout for me too.
yes, Steve.
What were the actual charges for the impeachment?
The charge.
The charges.
Well, grounds, I mean, what were?
It was, we'll get to that, but it was
Okay,
basically.
you said it started here, so.
Yeah, it starts, it was obstruction of justice, conspiracy to break and enter,
Okay.
and,
But that's later after they
Yeah.
heard the tapes and everything.
Yeah, after they-
Involved, right?
which you're gonna see because the indictment of the Watergate conspiracy names President Nixon as an unindicted co-conspirator. Um, So we have the Saturday Night Massacre, and then Vice President Agnew resigns as part of a deal to avoid prison for his corruption. And President Nixon picks Jerry Ford to be his new vice president. And he's confirmed by the Senate late in the fall, in November of '73. Now, also, at this point, the public opinion turns against President Nixon. Up to that point, there had been more awareness of his potential involvement. But because of his firing of Cox and the Saturday Night Massacre, public opinion shifted pretty dramatically in the direction that away from President Nixon. So he became very defensive. And in the beginning of November, he held a press conference that you all may recall, but we thought it would be good to remind everybody.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got. President? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, you can see he is starting to go off the rails here. And it's clear that there's a reason that they're not turning over the tapes, and it's not because of executive privilege, with all due respect to all of them. So it turns out that 3 days later, the White House offers an explanation or a disclosure that it turns out there happens to be an 18-minute gap on the conversation, the first conversation President Nixon has between himself and Bob Haldeman on June 20th, 1972. Rosemary Woods must have volunteered to take the fall on this, but it's pretty clear in retrospect that she didn't do anything. Anyway, we thought...
Wait, why do you say that? It's not clear in retrospect that she did nothing.
No, that's true.
No, that's not fair.
Okay.
We don't know. By the way, where are the tapes during all of this?
Well, the tapes are also in the White House.
We
right
don't
now.
have the tapes.
We don't have them.
Judiciary doesn't have the tapes. Special prosecutors doesn't have the tapes. That stuff's still, meanwhile, what's she doing?
And now she's showing her stretch where she may have accidentally hit record rather than listen.
But the follow-up question is, why is she listening to the tapes that nobody
Right.
else apparently can get, right? It's a whoops.
Right. Now, by this
Because
point,
she's making transcripts and
All
there's 18 minutes disappearance. Where you, look at the tape where the 18 minutes are disappearing. How many days after the break-in? Please.
Marion, I'm sorry.
So Nixon kept continuing to record.
Oh, I don't know.
When Butterfield said, yes, there were devices, but did Nixon stop, or did he just kept going?
Yes, he kept going. He kept
Because
going.
it was history.
Yeah. Yeah, and
He was his.
part of what we found out was he'd actually consulted a tax lawyer to discover whether if he donated his tapes, he could get a big deduction. He donated his tapes to a nonprofit or charitable institution, he could get it, or even the Smithsonian, he could get a big tax deduction for that. So we thought maybe that's why. But fortunately, he didn't have a bonfire on the White House lawn and destroy the tapes. As you think about this whole chain of events, you do the thought experiment, what would have happened had there been a big bonfire and nobody would ever hear the tapes? Would it have had a different ending? And so on.
Well, Warren, Rosemary Woods, can I share my Rosemary Woods story?
Oh, well, it turns out, let me just set it up if I can. It turns out that later on, we're trying to follow some money that Bibi Rebozo has kept in a safe deposit box, allegedly, for the president. And Rosemary Woods we've subpoenaed her to talk about how money was kept from President Nixon and where, and so on.
So once again,
Mary,
second time now, a witness has appeared at G308. We've already explained they're not supposed to be coming to G308. This picture was put in, of Rosemary Woods in her stretch, was put into a cartoon format. So Rosemary Woods comes into the front office where the various secretaries are who are working on the punch cards for the computer system. And she announces that she's there for the interview. And she sees this cartoon and she is furious. Now, the boys back in the actual bowels of G308 are told that Miss Woods is waiting for them to take her for her interview. And Terry bravely says, no way, I'm not going to do it. Mary, you go get Miss Woods and you bring her down on the Senate has these little trolleys that go underneath that connect the Senate office buildings with the Capitol. You take her to the Capitol and we'll have urban staffer meet you there, and that person will take her up to Urban's hideaway office for preparations for the executive session. Now, I have no sense of direction, and I have been stuck in G308 for the last year. I've only been on that trolley once myself. There's no need for me to go to the Capitol. I'm supposed to be doing what I'm doing in this. Okay, so I go and get her. She's absolutely ripped. I'm as pleasant as can be, and off we go. And I know how to get to the elevator, and I know how to get on the little trolley, but I'm not confident when I get off. So, unbeknownst to me, it stops at the Russell office building before it actually goes underneath the street to the Capitol. So I confidently suggest this is where we're going to get off, and when she's behind me with her lawyer, and we go up, and I can see that we clearly aren't at our destination because I'm looking at the Capitol, it's across the street. And she says to me, I knew you didn't know what you were doing. And I said to her just as confidently, I most certainly didn't know what I was doing. I wanted to be sure we weren't being followed. And if this become back, I am sweating. God, let's just get her there.
Yeah.
So there you go.
yeah, it was a great setup for the interview. Anyway.
Is this a public interview?
No.
No. This was an executive
And
session.
the other thing that part of I was tasked with, although it was a marginal story, is that I had all of her financial records, and it was my responsibility to go through her check. You know, in those days, you had a checkbook register. I had her registers. I was watching her cash. I was comparing that with telephone records and with bank records, just to put together the narration of where does she spend her money, because it was our thinking that she had the cash. Well, she did, she had cash. It wasn't going to show in any of this stuff, but I at least determined that it couldn't be followed in any kind of electronic way.
And in fact, learned that she kept a private list of the top contributors to Nixon's re-election campaign. It was called Rosemary's Baby. And that was part of the spur for campaign finance reform, to disclose contributions, to limit contributions, and
So
to,
how well that's worked.
yeah,
It for a very
it worked like a
short
charm.
time.
It worked like a charm. I'm
I
sorry.
think all she did is press record.
And then
It goes over because that's when you record over the guts of something that's been recorded. Yes, no, she was not, she was very competent.
Okay, so on November 20th, the White House reveals that there's an 18-minute gap, 19-minute gap Okay, fast forward a couple more months, and the special prosecutor's grand jury indicted Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell, and as part of the 7 co-conspirators. And President Nixon is named then as an unindicted co-conspirator, primarily on the issue of obstruction of justice, which was the easiest case to make by far. Meanwhile, the case is still going through the courts. And shortly after the grand jury indictment, the Supreme Court agrees to hear the appeal of the White House and our appeal of the appellate court decision on giving the special prosecutor the tapes and denying them to us. So we now have, in essence, a Supreme Court case. And meanwhile, nobody knows, we're not sure if the tapes are going to support John Dean or they're going to show that he's a self-serving, double-dealing rat. It's all still up in the air. I can't, and given the fact that there are limited media sources at the time, limited national channels and national newspapers, there was quite a buzz and quite a lot of energy around what the Supreme Court was going to do with respect to the tapes. Finally, July 24th.
Oh, sorry. This was supposed to be a surprise.
July 24th, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Nixon had to turn the tapes over to the special prosecutor. Once again, we were denied the tapes, which we thought was ironic since we discovered them. And then you know how things unfolded after that. Their smoking gun was the tape of June 23rd, 1972, when President Nixon directed Bob Haldeman to tell the CIA, to tell the FBI to back off, that this was involved the CIA in national security. And obviously Nixon had known about the cover-up and had directed the cover-up literally from the get-go, going back. So finally
And the court was right.
And yeah, that James McCord was completely right that they were going to try and pin it on the CIA. So on August 8th, August 7th, a number of Republican leaders, specifically Hugh Scott, the minority leader of the Senate, and John Rhodes from the House, and a number of other Republicans visited President Nixon at the White House to tell him that his support had vanished with the disclosure of the tapes, and that he was going to be impeached and convicted, which then led him to give his speech the night of August 8th and to resign on the morning of August 9th. There's a picture of him leaving the White House for the last time. I remember the morning of August 9th. We remember the morning of August 9th very clearly because we slept in for the first time in about a year and a half. And when we woke up, we had a little black and white television at the foot of our bed. And so we turned it on to see President Nixon's last talk to his staff and talking about his mother being a saint, and that if you demonize your enemies, you're going to demonize yourself, which I thought was a bit of self-knowledge that took him a long time to get to. And then he gets in the helicopter, and the helicopter takes off from the White House lawn. And Mary and I look at each other, 2 kids from Ohio who found themselves in this maelstrom for the last year and a half. And both of us, at the same time, burst into tears because we thought, what the hell have we done? What has happened?
I asked you, who's in charge?
Right. So, as we move along, I wanted to move to more discussion now, since we've covered what we wanted to cover with respect to the facts. And I have a couple of videos we want to share. And they go to the question that I would like to open for discussion in the class of whether the system actually worked or were we just lucky. And I think my own answer, just to preempt everything, is we were lucky, clearly. We were lucky that John Dean had a photographic memory. We were lucky that the taping system was installed in the White House. We found out about it, and the president didn't destroy it.
And we were lucky for McCord.
We were lucky that the pressure put on James McCord backfired, and he cracked open the conspiracy. So, in terms of bottom line, let's go to some of the videos. We have 3 videos, 3 different perspectives. The first one is from a Washington Post reporter who just published a couple years ago a new book called Watergate: A New History.
Few presidential scandals occupy a place in America's culture like Watergate. And this summer, it will be 50 years since 5 burglars broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters, setting off a series of investigations that ultimately led to the resignation of then-President Richard Nixon. But as historian and author Garrett Graff told me recently, the scandal we all thought we knew was actually a series of events. That's the focus of his latest book, Watergate: A New History. Garrett Graff, welcome to the NewsHour. Congratulations on the book. So it has been 50 years. A lot of books have been written. Why did you think it's time for another one, and another one that's 800 pages long almost?
Well, as much as Watergate has been sliced and diced over the years, it's actually been a quarter century since anyone actually tried to lay out the full story, start to finish, soup to nuts. And during that time, of course, we've had an enormous number of new revelations that actually really dramatically change the arc of the story that we thought we knew. This is the first time anyone's tried to write a history of Watergate knowing the identity of Deep Throat. Former FBI Deputy Director Mark Felt outed it as that famous source for Woodward and Bernstein. The Nixon tapes have come out. New FBI files have been declassified. We've learned all sorts of things about some of the associated scandals with Watergate itself. And what I found in researching this is that the Watergate story that we thought we knew isn't what actually happened.
And in connection with that, you write that it's more than one event. It's not just a burglary. It's a number of things. Of course, a lot of it had to do with the war in Vietnam. But you went on to say it was an entire mindset, Watergate was. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, the thing that we now sort of shorthand as Watergate, the moment when the 5 burglars are caught in the Democratic National Committee offices at the Watergate office complex in D.C. in June 1972, really is just one tiny slice of the crime and criminality and abuses of power by the Nixon administration that unfolded over the course of his presidency across what end up being a dozen vaguely related scandals with some of the same players. And by the time that burglary gets to the impeachment process in the spring of 1974, Watergate morphs into this much bigger umbrella that encompasses all of these different scandals and all of these shadowy, weird, zany players.
I was struck by this descriptive line. You said it's the greatest story ever told about power in D.C., the need and the hunger for it, the drive to protect it, how it's challenged, and how it flows. The best and really the worst of this capital city.
Yeah, and that's part of what made me so fascinated with Watergate at this moment in our politics, because what you see is this moment from 1972 to 1974 where Washington works. And what is so fascinating about the power as it unfolds in this city back then is you see all of the different institutions come together to force Nixon from office, to investigate him, to prosecute his team in a way that none of them could do on their own. And so it becomes this incredible story about the American system, about the checks and balances, and how Article 1 of the Constitution, Article 2, Article 3, all interlock and play with things like the Justice Department and, of course, the reporters who covered that story to do something that no one of them could do on their own.
You also note how Watergate was the dividing line between old Washington and new Washington. Explain what you meant by that.
Watergate, in many ways, is the turning point, the central hinge of the 20th century in the U.S. government. You have this moment where you have this new generation of leaders ushered into Washington. This is a generation that reshapes the Capitol, reshapes Washington. And then many of the parts of the investigative press that we are now used to, the Washington Press Corps, you see first come to that investigative mindset in the midst of Watergate. And then, of course, so much of the reforms, the protections around abuses of power, privacy, civil liberties in America grow up out of the worst of Watergate.
How much new was there to find out?
Well, one of the great maxims that, that sort of our whole country, I feel like, has adopted after Watergate was this idea, the cover-up is worse than the crime. And what we learn actually with all of the accumulated knowledge of the last 50 years is that that's actually probably not true with Watergate, with the Nixon years, that actually in many ways the crimes were terrible. There were many more of them than we knew at the time. There were reasons to believe that Nixon even, walked right up to the line of outright treason in trying to encourage the collapse of the Paris peace talks that would end the Vietnam War to keep the Vietnam War going for his own political benefit in the fall of 1968 as he was running for president. Many of these details have only come out in the last couple of years.
You mentioned the criminality of Richard Nixon. I was struck because I've seen you say that after all this time you spent studying Nixon, that you were taken by the similarities and the contrast with former President Trump.
Yeah, as we reckon with the abuses of the Nixon years, the scandals of the Trump administration, and of course, the two impeachments that Donald Trump went through as president and just after his presidency. And in many ways, the things that worked in 1972, 1973, 1974 didn't work during the Trump years. And it's worth, I think, thinking about why that happened. And there's a lot that we can learn about how Washington doesn't work today by going back and looking at the Nixon years.
Well, it is quite an undertaking, quite a book, Watergate, A New History, on the 50th anniversary of the Watergate break-in. Garrett Graff, thank you very much.
Judy, it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Yes.
That wasn't your voice.
Yeah, Bob.
Question, I was deployed in 1974, so we didn't have access to the news, but we heard, based on my recollection, we had stories percolating up to us that Al Haig, first of all, that Nixon was so incapacitated that Al Haig was really running the executive branch. Mm-hmm. And so how unconstitutional was that? I think, if I recall, it wasn't Haig still in active
I'm just going to
duty?
repeat it, that Al Haig in 74, it was percolated up to Bob, that Haig was actually taking a lot of executive action because Nixon was incapacitated with the ongoing investigations of what was going on with Watergate.
So it wasn't really the president, and as I recall, I think he was still on active duty.
Haig himself was a
He was a four-star sporting a combat infantry badge.
Yeah.
So how unconstitutional is that?
Well, it's the Constitution really doesn't specifically deal with that kind of situation. It does now when the president's incapacitated. The 26th Amendment provides a process by which the cabinet can vote to delegate to the vice president the executive duties. But at that point, we didn't have that, that amendment.
He thought he was in line for president.
Right, remember, right, he said, I'm in charge now. Well, I don't remember.
That was right. He grabbed me at one point when Haig was chief of staff. He grabbed the podium and said, "I'm in charge here," which kind of frightening when you see it's a military officer.
And also, he was wrong. He wasn't that wasn't the right pecking order.
Right.
No. All right. Should we go on?
Yeah, I think part of I would take issue with the the blanket statement that Washington doesn't work. I think if you look at the results of the election, it actually has worked because it reflects what the voters voted for, in a sense. And so I think that the perspective of Graff is a little bit biased toward the result he wanted, which was, why don't we have a repeat now? And it goes back to the question I raised in the first class. Can the same scandals step in the same culture twice? And the answer is no. The scandal has changed and the culture has changed. And we talked a little bit about that. This really drives home how we're dealing with it now. And so I have another video of former President Obama talking about what is to be done now in this new environment. And let's hear what he has to say. It's
saying
biased as well.
It is up to all of us to fix this. It's not going to be because somebody comes and saves you. The most important office in this democracy is the citizen, the ordinary person who says, no, that's not right. And I do think one of the reasons that our commitment to democratic ideals has eroded is that we got pretty comfortable and complacent. It has been easy during most of our lifetimes to say you are progressive, or say you are for social justice, or say you're for free speech, and not have to pay a price for it. And now we're at one of those moments where, it's not enough just to say you're for something. You may actually have to do something and possibly sacrifice a little bit. So, if you're a law firm being threatened, you might have to say, okay, we will lose some business because we're going to stand for a principle. If you are a university, you may have to say, figure out, are we in fact doing things right? Have we in fact violated our own values, our own code, violated the law in some fashion? If not, and you're just being intimidated, well, you should be able to say, well, that's why we got this big endowment. We'll stand up for what we believe in, and then we'll pay our researchers for a while out of that endowment, and we'll give up the extra wing or the fancy gymnasium that we can delay that for a couple of years, because academic freedom might be a little more important. For most of human history, and to this day in most of places in the world, there is a cost to challenging the powers that be, particularly if they're abusing that power. And this idea, and I've noticed this among some wealthier folks who, after George Floyd, they were right there, and a bunch of companies were talking about how they cared about diversity and they wanted to do this and they were all for that, and they are mute right now. But what that tells me is it was okay when it was cool and trendy, and when it's not, not so much. And that, I think, is what we have to, each of us has to examine in our own hearts. Is all right, we say we're for equality. Are we willing to fight for it? Are we going to risk something for it? We say that we're for rule of law. Are we going to stick to that when it's tough, not when it's easy? We believe in freedom of speech. Do we stand up for freedom of speech when the other person talking is saying stuff that infuriates us and is wrong and hurtful? Do we still believe in it?
Okay.
When was that? How do you get the date?
Yeah, is it up there right now?
It was just recent.
Yeah, I think it was last.
It is, but it wasn't like yesterday.
No, it's,
It was about a month ago.
Yeah, Doug says 2-3 weeks ago.
Yeah, well, I found that, and I just thought that was an interesting perspective from President Obama. And then we wanted to give Tim Naftali the last word on these questions. Tim is the first executive director of the Nixon Foundation, a respected historian of American history and an academic who I think is respected on both sides of the aisle. Let's go to him. This is an interview by Walter.
To the Constitution.
But wait, do you worry then about the way he changed the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the way he put a somewhat unconventional pick as Secretary of Defense, all loyalists to him?
Yes, I worry. I worry deeply, Walter. One of the lessons of studying the periods in our history when we've had quasi-authoritarians in power is that the system can correct itself or right itself. And usually it rights itself because members of the, I don't want to use the term elite, but among those with power and influence in our society come to a bipartisan understanding that authoritarian action threatens the fabric of who we are, of our society. And so in 1974, you had elected Republicans come to the conclusion that Richard Nixon had to go. In the 1950s, you had elected Republicans who came to the conclusion that Joe McCarthy's reign of terror had to end. That's how our system works. It doesn't work because the opponents to the president succeed.
Are you seeing some signs that could happen? Are there things changing?
Not yet. I saw glimmers of this when a few Republican senators a note of disapproval of the president. Those senators understood that they lacked the power to change the president's approach on tariffs towards Canada, but they did send a signal. What I'm seeing, though, are the beginnings of a retrenchment on the part of the president that indicate to me that the president and his inner team think they might be losing popular support. So we are seeing the president pull back a little bit on the issue of international students. It's not quite clear what's going to happen to the Liberation Day tariffs, which have been universally denounced for being stupid. Besides being high, they don't actually have any economic logic attached to them. And the public isn't buying them. The president's approval ratings on the economy are lower than they have been. I believe they're lower than they were in the first term on the economy. So the president himself is retrenching a little. So I see a little bit of institutional pushback on the Hill. I see a lot more institutional pushback on the part of universities and some law firms. So we're beginning to see a reawakening of the American constitutional order. But let's be fair and let's be clear about this. For the first 2/3 of this 100 days, it appeared that the American constitutional system was asleep and the president was acting without any pushback. The situation has changed, and I think will continue to change.
One of the things that has driven his popularity is he's tapped into resentments against the elite that you just mentioned might be there to save us. I think at one point in the campaign rally in 2024, he said, "I am your warrior. I am your justice. For those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution."
Yes.
He's even pushed retribution against people like Cheney or against the law firms and others. Do you think this spirit of retribution is something that he's actually tapped into, and how dangerous is that?
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that he has tapped into a popular desire uh, for change, and in some cases for retribution. I think the disquiet in our country goes back to the Great Recession and the unequal recovery that that regions of this country experienced. I don't doubt that the pandemic sharpened unhappiness and divisions in our country. I think about 15, 20 years from now, we're going to have pandemic studies in various universities, because I don't think we fully absorbed or processed the actual effect, political, cultural, and social, of the pandemic on our country, let alone the world. So yes, there was a lot of disquiet and anger that he could tap into.
If you look at Nixon's campaign, he ran on resentments to the elite. So did Andrew Jackson. We've had this before.
He ran on resentments, but what he didn't promise was retribution. That's the key difference. He wanted retribution, and he tried to use his government to achieve it, but good government Republicans pushed back and wouldn't allow him to do what he wanted to do with the IRS. The enemies list was initially his idea as a tax list, and he was never able to implement it. My point simply is that American leaders have tapped into resentment, whether it was resentment in the South for the Civil Rights Revolution. Yes. What Donald Trump did that's so different is that he made retribution his governing philosophy, and he told everyone he would. And now he's doing it. Now, the question I have for fellow Americans is that who we are? Is that how we want to be governed? And I'm not convinced, Walter, that there is a sustainable, broad governing coalition behind a government of retribution. But maybe I'm an optimist. I don't know.
Tim Natale, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you for asking me on. Thank you, Walter.
Great.
Are we done? Because also.
Yeah, Lance, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you guys what you guys thought about Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon. I don't think we mentioned that, and what effect that's had on American history from that point forward. And also, I wonder, and I think you will know this, Mark, when did the Justice Department devise a policy that you cannot prosecute a criminal act against the president when he's president? Because in every foreign country other than in the world, you can do that.
Right. Let's take them in order. Let's talk about President Ford's pardon of President Nixon. I was really surprised by that. And I actually thought initially that had been part of a deal that Nixon had cut with Ford before he resigned. I actually thought that, he'd had a conversation where either explicitly or implicitly, he raised the possibility of being pardoned, and Ford agreed to it. Now, there's never been any proof of that, but I was very suspicious of it, just knowing how desperately Nixon didn't want to resign and wanted to stay in office. So I was surprised and really disappointed by it. And I think it actually was the reason that Ford lost the election in '76. I think if you look back and sort through all the data and all the issues that were on the table at that point, it was a very close election. And had Ford not pardoned Nixon, he might have gotten elected on his own. So I was personally, I guess, disappointed, and I didn't like it. With respect to the issue of the policy of the Justice Department not prosecuting a president while he's in office, the Supreme Court has now given its own implicit approval to some of that by granting a pretty wide circle of immunity to the president for official acts, whatever those happen to be. And I think I've been disappointed by that, because I thought one of the principles that came out of our investigation was that no man or woman was above the law. And this merely creates an opportunity where somebody clearly is above or certainly outside the law. So I don't like that either. So yeah, I'm disgruntled on both counts, Lance.
Yeah, but imagine, I hear what you're saying. Of course, the immunity decision was a real stunner when it came down. But
Yeah.
I mean, imagine a president, if it not for the policy of the Justice Department, let's just say we have a president who goes down and rapes somebody. As unimaginable as that might be, given our presidents, but then you're not able to prosecute him for that until after you impeach him and he leaves office. I mean, is that a real, does that policy make any sense within the Justice Department?
From my perspective, no.
But Lance, act, so you would have to deem the rape to have been an official act, which is possible. You have like a little bit of leeway in the Supreme Court.
Right.
I'm kind of curious.
Yes, Doug.
I was surprised to hear what you said about pardoning Nixon. I felt, and I'm a Democrat, but I felt Ford looked at the nation, and we'd been dragged through this for years, and I thought there was a very selfless act on his part. And I voted for him. I remember trying to convince other Democrats to vote for him. Because I thought he really did.
Yeah, he was a very decent man.
Yeah, he was.
In fact, you could make a very good case. I think that's the opposing case. I was telling you my own reaction.
Right, no, it's interesting.
Yeah, Bob.
I would love to sit down with a cup of coffee with Barack Obama and Natali about some of the issues that they brought up. I think the first thing that troubles me with one of the trends in our country over the last couple of decades is the degradation of First Amendment rights. There's one case that always comes to mind, but there are tons of others. And that's when a meteorologist from Spokane, Cliff Mast, who happens to be Jewish, and had a private blog that he wrote about, like I write every day. And he happened to be a meteorologist, worked for the public broadcasting system. Actually, and he had a weather program with NPR. Mm-hmm. And so one weekend in the middle of the Seattle riots, he made the trek across the state.
He made the what?
Trek across the state.
He drove across the state and he made some observations. He took some photographs. And then on Tuesday morning after that weekend, he wrote on his blog that Seattle looked like Kristallnacht. And they fired him because they didn't like how he described that situation. We could go on and we could talk about 2012, when the Obama administration, through Lois Lerner, attacked people who didn't ideologically align with the Barack Obama administration. And so those people were persecuted for some of those things. We could go on and on. You know, the people in Washington right now do that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But as a libertarian, I think that we do this in our class on Thursday nights. We agree to disagree. But I'm not so sure we're a tolerant society anymore. And that troubles me, because that First Amendment, that part of the First Amendment, really differentiates us from the rest of human civilization.
Sometimes
it's a good point, Bob. Lynn, did you want to?
Yeah, sometimes the First Amendment is pretty fuzzy. So look at all the young people in universities that were getting together against what's going on over in Israel and Pakistan, and it was that free speech or is that anti-Semitism? Mm-hmm. So then we get into, I mean, that's what I mean when I say it can be kind of fuzzy to determine free speech these days.
Well, it gets to the question of when speech becomes a call to action, which it doesn't have the same kind of protection that speech does. And I think the points you're raising, Bob, they're troubling points, because We protect speech that's scientifically factually wrong. We protect speech that's hate speech. And it requires a certain amount of tolerance, but on the other hand, how much do I tolerate if somebody says they want to kill me because of my religion? Am I violating the First Amendment by deciding I better take care of them before they take care of me? You know, those are tough questions, and I think the absolutists, I find I don't have any sympathy with the absolutists on either side, that it's a gray area and you need to take it case by case. And that's not good for when you're in a heated discussion, but I think it's unfortunately the truth. Yeah, Paul.
Well, one of the fallouts of this, which concerns me, is the fact that Roger Ailes, who was one of the founders of Fox News, basically said that he founded that so that what the Democrats had done to Richard Nixon could never again be done to a Republican president.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically, and all the institutions, you know, they've been very clever about, you know, Heritage Foundation, and, you know, and all this, to basically have institutional protections so that our checks and balances that we've been talking about don't work.
Except just a voice on the other side. Some checks and balances, as recently as today,
yes,
are working. When you look at these Liberation Day tariffs, that 3 courts, 3 judges appointed by 3 different presidents said, not so. You've reached outside your permitted power and it's unconstitutional. You look at the universities and they are lining up together. You look at the law firms, and Paul White, sort of the first ones to really get slammed and they acquiesce, have lost 4 main partners. The other law firms are still in front of the courts, and what's the count so far?
Well, it's remarkable that over the 200 lawsuits that have been filed, the litigants have prevailed, the plaintiffs have prevailed on close to 95% of these lawsuits. And 80% of Democratic appointed judges have ruled against various initiatives of this administration. And 72% of Republican appointed judges have done the same thing. This is a study that was just released about a week ago.
Who did that study, Mark?
I'm sorry, Steve?
Who did that study?
A political scientist from a Midwestern university. I forget his name. I just read about it yesterday.
But that's only with the
And it was actually, I found the courts not to be relatively reassuring, assuming that people are going to follow what the court decides.
What happens
Doug points out that all we're looking at is the judicial institutions.
Unless Congress steps up, the court stuff isn't going to matter.
Well, and look at all the money that's spent on all these friggin' lawsuits.
Well, I'm sorry, Maggie, I
Look
can
at
hear
all the money that has been spent defending what really is our right to begin with.
Right.
And we're still not there yet. We're still talking.
Well, unfortunately,
That's a system.
it's a slow process.
Right.
I know.
But I wanted to ask about what Doug said. Where are Republicans? I mean, do we have any Republicans standing up at all to this nonsense?
I think that's the biggest, I actually think that's the biggest difference between 1974 and today, which is the Republican Party in 74 was not Richard Nixon come hell or high water. And remember when Trump said he could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and he wouldn't lose any support? I mean, it's remarkable how dedicated and loyal his base is.
Wait, I want to come back to what Maggie's saying. You know a huge difference? Trump and Musk hold the purse strings, and the guys and the women who are coming out of constituencies where they are dependent on the money coming from Trump are not going to say a word for fear of losing. Now we're coming into midterms. Let's see.
He's also threatened some of those folks.
Oh, very clearly, Lynn, very, very clearly.
Explicitly.
explicitly.
I actually want to go back to a point that Paul raised about Roger Ailes, because I had a kind of a personal story about that. One of my stops along the way was as chief of staff or staff director and chief counsel of a subcommittee on telecommunications and finance in the House of Representatives. And my biggest telecommunications analyst was a guy named Tom Rogers. He went on to help found MSNBC and CNBC for General Electric, which was what his next job was. And he told me about a year ago that the biggest mistake he ever made was hiring Roger Ailes, and that he had to do it. Jack Welch came to him and said, I want you to hire Roger Ailes to help you create CNBC and MSNBC, because you have no experience in these areas, but he has. And so Tom hired him, and then Ailes went on, left CNBC to found Fox News. And as you said and noted, the rest is history. And Tom said, you know, I sort of feel partly personally responsible for all this. He's been very successful in business and, you know, can buy and sell us thousands of times, but he still talks about how he just made a mistake with Roger Ailes, unfortunately. Does anybody think that something like the Senate Watergate Committee could happen again today?
Yeah.
And if not, why not? I guess.
I think there's a political will on the Republican side. I don't even see how you would start a committee with half the players missing. I don't feel big confidence that the Republicans are going to step up. That might be concerning.
Well, I agree with you. I think the bipartisanship of 74 has become the B-U-Y partisanship of today. And given that, it's very hard to see how anything is going to create an institution that everybody respects. So I'm somewhat heartened by what's happening in the courts. And I think that's a good sign. The Supreme Court has really not held forth on major issues yet. It may have the opportunity to do so, and will have the opportunity to do so in the next 6 to 8 months with a number of these cases percolating up to that, but not now.
Joyce.
Yeah, Joyce.
Don't you think that the January 6th committee, even though the Republicans on it were people who wanted to be on it, and they all, lost their seats and are being attacked with retribution, isn't that just evidence that we could not do what you did in 70?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it was on TV, it seemed self-evident, and now all these people get pardoned and they're out there running around, and people, even, Johnson saying they're good people. I mean, come on.
Well, they're politicians. So.
Yeah, but I know, but I don't think that was an example of how you
it's terrible place itself.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm going to ask
Okay.
one thing.
Yeah, Chris.
Would you reconvene us after some of these court cases are settled?
Yeah, I'd love to do it. I'd love to do it. That may be do you want to say anything before we close?
No. Can you imagine that? I'll save it for later.
No. We've run out of time and material, but I wanted to thank all of you. This has been a terrific experience for us. We've really enjoyed it. I appreciate your involvement and participation. We obviously haven't solved much, but at the same time, it's like we used to say in law school, there are no easy answers, but they're tough questions. But thank you for your participation and involvement, and I hope you've gotten something positive out of the course.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.